Hello, I'm Andrew Pritchard, and thank you for watching today's Western Regional Forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. Eric Snodgrass is catching an early morning flight back from Canada today, so I'm filling in for him while he travels back to Illinois safely here, and then he will resume the Western Regional Forecast on Tuesday morning. But alas, we'll jump in. We'll look at the most recent 72 hours of precipitation across the entire lower 48. We've seen a couple things here. We watched Barry make its way up the lower Mississippi Valley into the Ohio River Valley before hooking off to the east, bringing thunderstorms to parts of the eastern Corn Belt and eventually parts of the eastern U.S. We've also watched this corridor continue to be active with repeated development of clusters of thunderstorms from the Dakotas into parts of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes. Also seeing some thunderstorm activity across parts of the Southwest, parts of eastern Arizona into New York, getting into New Mexico. Jeez, another cup of coffee. I promise I know the western U.S. region here, and then into parts of Colorado. Also seeing some thunderstorm activity over the top of this ridge. In parts of the far northwest, here parts of Washington, getting into northern portions of Idaho and parts of Montana, seeing some severe weather activity here over the last 72 hours. So you look at the hazards map from the National Weather Service here on Friday morning, a big area of the eastern two-thirds of the country dealing with this hot and humid air mass. We've got excessive heat warnings where you see the pink shading there, and then the orange shading is heat advisories surrounding that, where they've got the afternoon high temperatures in the mid-90s, dew points in the middle to upper 70s, creating heat indices each day here between 100 and 115 as we head through the first part of the weekend. Across the western U.S., we've got a couple areas here with fire weather warnings, where we've got very hot and dry conditions with blustery winds during the afternoon, especially portions of southern Idaho and portions of Utah and far northwestern Colorado, again dealing with some of those fire weather advisories here as we head into the early part of the weekend. Now, as we look at the jet stream on Friday morning, dealing with broad ridging over the eastern two-thirds of the country here, that is the reason for the very hot and muggy air mass over the Midwest into parts of the Northeast region. But as we go through the next few days, we're going to be looking for a shift in the jet stream, kicking this ridge off to the west, and that is going to allow heat to build into this region, while cooler and drier air spills into the eastern two-thirds of the country. So looking at the temperature anomaly forecast here for the next 5 and the next 10 days, July 19th through the 24th over here, we're seeing a bit of the transition phase here across the middle part of the country. That's why you're seeing kind of closer to average. We're seeing a mix of that hot air mass that's there Friday through Sunday, and then the cooler air mass that follows, and also not seeing really the full extent of the heat building in here on the western United States here over the next 5 days. But as we look at the 5 days that follow, July 25th through the 29th, the pattern is pretty evident here, with ridging over the western U.S., troughing over the eastern United States, keeping things hot over the western United States with that cooler air mass spilling in from the north across the Midwest. The precipitation forecast now for the next 2 weeks, week 1 on the left, week 2 on the right. And again, we see the transition here right now moving to the ridge over the western United States, and then we get into the week 2 time period, kind of flattening out a little bit, more zonal flow with disturbances traveling along that. So we'll really kind of resume an active phase here from parts of the western U.S. region. You're talking about Montana and Wyoming, probably seeing those severe weather risks kind of ramp back up. And that, of course, continues off to the east across the Dakotas into the upper Midwest. We'll be watching for afternoon thunderstorm activity to begin ramping up here across the Four Corners region as well over the next 1 to 2 weeks. Checking in first with the high-resolution NAM model, this will just get us through the first part of the week, and again watching for thunderstorm activity flaring up across parts of the Four Corners regions here, primarily across New Mexico and Colorado. Further to the east that you go, the higher thunderstorm chances are going to be. Watching for the chance for the development of scattered showers and storms, perhaps some severe storms across parts of eastern Montana here Friday before this front begins to sag south through the region, kind of taking thunderstorm chances off to the south along with it. So really Friday going to be the last big chance for a more sizable severe weather risk across eastern Montana before we kind of shut it down for a few days, at least until we get to the end of the next week. The total accumulated precipitation forecast then for the next 2.5 days, this takes us through 2 p.m. Sunday. Again, watching for just widely isolated thunderstorm activity across portions of New Mexico. You can follow that up here to parts of eastern Montana and eastern Wyoming, the chance for the development of some thunderstorms. Otherwise, mostly dry across the western U.S., especially as we build this ridge into the region. Really not going to be looking at any kind of significant precipitation opportunities over the next few days. Check in with the temperature forecast from the high resolution NAM model, and this is where you can really see that front begin to move southward across the Midwest into the Great Lakes, but then building that heat back in over the western U.S. to start to see this kind of build in towards the end of the loop. We'll see it better when we look at the European model, the long range forecast here. We'll start with the jet stream. I'm going to let this go ahead and start over, and we'll just talk about what we've got right now, which is this broad ridging over the eastern two-thirds of the country, keeping the heat locked in over the Midwest into the Northeast region here as we go through the weekend. That's the reason for those excessive heat warnings. As we play this out, though, getting it into now Tuesday, we see a big change. That ridge now over the western U.S., it's going to allow that heat to build in over the west. And as we look to the east, seeing cooler conditions begin to spill in across the Midwest into the Northeast region. So a big transition as we head into the early part of next week, as we get to at least the backside of the weekend, again into Monday and Tuesday, really seeing that transition take shape. Now, as we continue on into the end of next week, still keeping broad areas of high pressure over the western U.S., but starting to allow some of these troughs to sneak in over the top of that. And that's where, as we get into the end of next week, perhaps at least over parts of Montana and Wyoming, bringing that thunderstorm activity back in. Of course, we'll look for at least isolated thunderstorm activity across parts of the Four Corners region here as we get into the monsoon season. But the thunderstorm chance is going to be highest across parts of Montana and Wyoming as we get into the end of next week. The precipitation forecast then from the European model, one thing you'll notice is that front sinking off to the south, taking the thunderstorm activity along with it across the central United States. We'll go through time with this one, bringing it back to Friday. And then you'll see also thunderstorms kind of moving up over the top of that ridge here across far northern areas of the western U.S. To start off the weekend. But we'll go through Friday and then Saturday. Getting into Sunday, we're watching this frontal boundary sink off to the south now, taking thunderstorms from the central plains into the eastern Corn Belt. As we get into the day on Monday now, seeing thunderstorm activity across parts of, parts of Arizona and New Mexico, getting into Colorado. Watching this front kind of stall out across this region now as we get into Tuesday afternoon. Getting into now Wednesday. And again, isolated thunderstorm activity across the Four Corners regions, pretty much dry elsewhere across the western U.S. until we get into the end of next week. Now, of course, confidence is going to be low. The detail is going to be lost as we look out this far, getting into the 7 to 10 day time frame. But this is when we start to see maybe the advertisement of some more well-defined storm systems with frontal boundaries sinking off to the south from there. Kind of bringing a resumption of the thunderstorm activity to at least the northern plains, but that does include parts of eastern Montana and Wyoming, again, as we get into the end of next week, and then we'll continue to watch for thunderstorm development each afternoon and evening across parts of the desert southwest. This continues as we get into next weekend. Again, really the corridor of thunderstorm activity each afternoon going to be best across this region, but perhaps resuming the daily thunderstorm activity late next week across parts of the north. Looking at the total accumulated forecast here from the European long-range model, taking it out for the next 10 days, taking us all the way through next weekend. And again, you see the frontal boundary move from north to the south across the eastern two-thirds of the country. As we talk about the western U.S., we'll go ahead and we'll just pause this once we get to the end of the loop, taking a look at everything. And really, you're seeing the afternoon thunderstorm activity, the monsoon thunderstorm activity across the Four Corners region. But broadly speaking, with ridging across the western United States, thunderstorm activity going to be deflected for the most part up and over the top of that ridge, avoiding the western U.S. in any kind of large-scale manner. The temperature forecast then, looking at temperature anomalies over the next 10 days. And again, seeing the heat locked in over the eastern two-thirds of the country. Cooler temperatures here to start off the weekend across the western U.S. But as we get to play this loop out, of course, you're seeing the transition as we get into next week. Cooler air mass now across the eastern two-thirds of the country, building that heat in across the western U.S. And this continues as long as we go into the end of next week, at least until the Thursday-Friday time frame, and that's when we'll keep the broad ridge over the western U.S., keeping things hot in this region, but allowing for at least some fluctuations across the northern regions here, where maybe we sneak in some thunderstorm activity, sneak in some brief cool downs, returning to a more typical summer pattern across this region. One more way of looking at the transition over the eastern two-thirds of the country here, we'll watch this very humid air mass move off to the south. We're looking at precipitable water, so a way of looking at the moisture content within the atmosphere. And again, you see this very humid air mass to start off across the eastern two-thirds of the country. As the loop plays out, you see the drier air coming in now from the north, that change in the air mass the front sinking off to the south. But as we get into the back side of this loop, getting into the end of next week, we're starting to see some of that moisture funnel back in along the high plains. And again, interacting with some of these little shortwave troughs diving out from the northwest, that could bring a resumption of thunderstorm activity across the northern high plains. We'll finish with a look at high temperatures for the next several days. We'll go ahead and bring this back here, starting off with the day on Friday. Cooler off to the north is where we've still got some cooler temperatures hanging on. High temperatures in the upper 60s to the mid 70s across this region. But as we play this out, getting into Saturday now, Sunday, you're watching things cool off over here. We're watching the heat build in from across the west. So here we go. We're on Sunday now, getting into Monday, Tuesday, seeing the heat really transitioning now across the western U.S. while we're cooling off across the east. We'll take it out just a bit further, Wednesday, and then Thursday as we get into the end of the week, still dealing with some pretty extreme heat across the southwest, but seeing some more fluctuations across the north as the ridge doesn't necessarily go away, but perhaps flattens out just a little bit, bringing chances for brief cool downs in thunderstorm activities to parts of Montana and Wyoming as we get into the end of next week. As always, Eric Snodgrass will have an in-depth look at the evolution of the next 1 to 2 weeks in our Monday morning ag forecast video, and he'll be back with your next Western U.S. regional forecast Tuesday morning. Have a great day and a wonderful weekend.